As in the case of flower, we have discussed that whenever the pollen reaches the ovary, then there is the process of fertilization. And so the fertilization, now we'll discuss what actually fertilization is. Fertilization occurs only when the pollen grains are transferred. So that pollen fertilization is basically the fusion of pollens with eggs in the ovary. That important process only takes place when there is transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma of the pistil, which is a process known as the pollination. Pollination is basically important as this process is involved in the transfer of pollen to ovary, to the stigma of pistil. That stigma of pistil, and then that pollen is transferred to the ovary for the process known as the fertilization. What actually pollination is? Pollination is basically transfer of pollen grains. So there are two major types of pollinations. First pollination is known as the self pollination, and second is known as the cross pollination. Self pollination, in this case, pollination of a stigma by pollen from the same flower or another flower of the same plant. In this, pollen is transferred to the stigma of same flower or another flower of same plant. Then this type of pollination is known as the self pollination. What actually happens in self pollination? That pollen is transferred to the stigma of same flower or another flower of the same plant. While in case of cross pollination, pollen is transferred to the another flower. Pollen is stigma of another flower which is basically present on another plant. In this case, pollen is not transferred to the stigma of any other flower of the same plant, but this is transferred to the another flower on another which is present on another plant. Then this type of known as the cross pollination.